Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into a truly massive topic, the very definition of the American identity in the 21st century. If you've ever stopped and wondered how a nation with such a vast, complicated, and turbulent history actually defines itself, well, you are in the right place. We're going to trace the historical DNA of the United States to figure out exactly who we are today. So, what does it actually mean to be American? It's the central question of this explainer, and honestly, it is incredibly tough to pin down. Think about it. In a nation built by indigenous peoples, European colonizers, enslaved Africans, and huge waves of immigrants from literally every corner of the globe, is there really a singular Americanism? How do you define a shared identity in a country that is fundamentally built on such intense diversity? Okay, let's dive into this. To help us make sense of it all, we're going to use a really fascinating framework from political scientist Deborah J. Schildkraut. She suggests that there actually isn't just one single American creed. Instead, American identity is defined by a complex, often contradictory set of norms and traditions that have just layered on top of each other over centuries. It's an idea called the multiple traditions theory. Here's our roadmap for the explainer. We're going to cover 1. Defining the American identity, 2. Roots of a diverse nation, 3. Forging a new republic, 4. Civil War and rebuilding, 5. The American century, and finally 6. A multi-creedal modern America. All right, part 1. Defining the American identity. What's absolutely fascinating about this theory is that it totally embraces the messiness. As Schildkraut points out, a complex and contradictory set of norms exist. These deeply ingrained contradictions, they aren't just an accident of American history. They are the defining structural feature of American identity. The constant friction between all these different ideals is exactly what makes the American identity what it is. Moving right along to part 2, roots of a diverse nation. Keep that identity lens in mind as we go back in time. Way before the United States was even a concept, this continent was already a site of massive cultural collision. You had thriving indigenous societies meeting Spanish explorers in the 1500s, English settlers in the 1600s, and then, tragically, the first enslaved Africans brought to the colonies in 1619. So, from the absolute very beginning, this was never a monolithic society. And it turns out this chaotic mix, that is the literal foundation of our contradictory norms. You had incredibly diverse indigenous populations like the powerful Iroquois Confederacy. You had fiercely competing European powers, the Spanish, Dutch, French, and English. And you had the brutal introduction of unfree African labor. The resulting society was just this complex web of different languages, beliefs, and violently competing interests laying the groundwork for those multiple traditions. Which brings us to part 3, forging a new republic. Things moved at absolute lightning speed in the late 18th century. I mean, in just a few short decades, we go from colonial integration during the French and Indian War straight into the Declaration of Independence in 1776. By 1787, a U.S. Constitution was drafted, and by 1791, the Bill of Rights was firmly in place. Just like that, the Republic was born. And this, brilliantly but tragically, illustrates the core contradiction of the era. On one hand, you have these soaring Republican ideals of liberty in the Declaration, boldly stating that all men are created equal. But sitting right alongside that is the brutal reality of slavery, physically written into the exact same Constitution through clauses like the Three-Fifths Compromise. The staggering tension between the ideal of liberty and the reality of institutional bondage is a prime example of the competing traditions defining the new nation. Let's jump to part 4, Civil War and rebuilding. By the mid-19th century, the pressure was just too much. Despite important social progress, like the dawn of the women's suffrage movement at Seneca Falls, the issue of slavery completely fractured the nation. The resulting Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation ultimately led to a preserved but deeply, deeply scarred union by 1865. Let's move to and see how this builds during Reconstruction. The very definition of what it meant to be a citizen got completely rewritten. Step 1, the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. Step 2, the 14th Amendment guarantees equal rights and citizenship to everyone born in the U.S., including formerly enslaved people. And Step 3, the 15th Amendment protects voting rights from racial discrimination. But again, we see the multiple traditions theory at play through some really intense backlash. The brief period of radical Reconstruction, where Black Americans exercised voting rights and held public office, was quickly followed by the Jim Crow era. This period saw white Southern Democrats regain power, violently suppressing voters through the KKK and enforcing strict legal segregation. The American identity was violently fractured between folks fighting for equal rights and those fighting to maintain white supremacy.
All right, on to part 5, the American century.
The 20th century was a total whirlwind. The U.S. rapidly transformed into a global superpower through 2 world wars. But at home, society was completely reshaping itself, from women winning the vote with the 19th Amendment in 1920 to surviving the economic devastation of the Great Depression, all the way to the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964. 22 million. Wow. It is honestly hard to wrap your head around a number like that. But that is the staggering wave of immigrants who arrived in the United States between 1880 and 1914 alone. This unprecedented migration completely revolutionized American demographics. It provided the labor that built the industrial age and brought entirely new cultures right into the American fold. This century fundamentally diversified the American creed. You had those 22 million immigrants arriving. You had the post-World War II economic boom that rapidly expanded a prosperous middle class. And you had the powerful social movements of the 1960s, like the civil rights and feminist movements, which directly challenged the status quo and effectively added entirely new voices and norms to our national identity. And finally, part 6, a multi-creedal modern America. Let's bring it back to today. So here is the crucial takeaway from all of this. Schildkraut's empirical research found that today, an increasingly multicultural America has actually created a multi-creedal America, meaning most of us, regardless of our backgrounds, actually accept these deep, messy contradictions as part of the whole package. Modern Americans fundamentally share this nuanced, complex view of the norms that make up American identity. Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought. We've seen how the definition of who gets to be an American has expanded, contracted, and evolved over centuries of conflict and progress. So, in an increasingly diverse 21st century, how will the American identity continue to evolve? What new traditions are going to be added to the mix? It's a fascinating question, and one we are all answering together right now. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope it leaves you with a lot to think about. Catch you next time!